you ask a vivisector, why is it okay to test on an animal, a non-human animal? Why is it okay to test on a mouse or a rabbit or a dog? And the answer will have this very thinly veiled hint of religion about it. It will be because they're not human. We went to raid our local mink farm when I was 15, and we were in like full camo gear, sat in this tree with binoculars until one of us realized it was the middle of winter. So literally everyone for about a mile could see us, just sat there with our balaclavas on. We often get told, one person can't change the world, but it's just so overtly not true. Like in just that one action, just one person has quite literally changed the world for someone else.
Hey Tom, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you. It's lovely to meet you. And thank you for having me.
Likewise, it's a real pleasure. And so far in this Sentientism series, I have actually interviewed two guests who then later went on to get married, Walter Veet and Heather Browning. I can't claim any credit for, I don't think, because they didn't know each other. They were all already together before. But this is the first time I will have interviewed two people who were married before. Your better half, Nicola, was on, I think, episode 157 with Anita Kreitch, talking about the plant-based treaty work as well. So it's brilliant to get to meet the other half of the team.
Yes, the lesser half. But yes, yes, no, it's great to be here. And yeah, Nikki's incredible and does amazing work. So people haven't listened to hers, then they should, because plant-based treaty stuff's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. As you know, because I presume being a good husband, you listen to that episode. This is a series of conversations about what I think of as this sort of deepest and most important philosophical questions, and frankly, the ones that most of humanity still gets wrong. And they're the questions of, what's real and how should we best understand reality? Questions of epistemology, if you like, but just as importantly, the questions of ethics: what matters and who matters, and how can we lead a good life, and what does that even mean? So I relentlessly focus on those sort of big questions, and I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple, broad, I guess it's like a philosophical platform or worldview, if you like, called sentientism, which I'll summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when it's answering the sort of what's real and how should we understand reality question, it suggests we should take a broadly naturalistic approach using evidence and reason and healthy dose of humility, which I would suggest is absolutely central to a good sort of naturalistic or a scientific approach to understanding the world. And on the ethical side, it's really pluralistic about what sort of ethics we use, but it's very insistent that the moral scope should include, and the clue is in the name, every sentient being. So any being that has the capacity to have experiences, to feel things, to suffer, to flourish, should be included, whatever ethical system we then apply. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a dazzling variety of different minds, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'd be great to understand your own sort of philosophical story and how that plays into the work you do today. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for those who haven't come across you yet?
So yeah, I'm Tom, obviously, Tom Harris. I have been involved in the animal liberation movement for over 20 years. Me and Nicola, who's now with the Plant-Based Treaty, you've already interviewed, we co-founded the Southern Animal Rights Coalition quite a few years ago now. And through that, we launched a series of very successful pressure campaigns, which saw us, we closed down a military research facility that was doing animal experiments on goats, and we rescued and rehomed all of the goats from that. We closed down a puppy farm, several chicken units. We exposed cosmetic testing of Botox on animals. And we, for a while at least, we got fur and foie gras out of every restaurant and shop in, I think, Southampton, Portsmouth, and Bournemouth. So we were very active with that, and we both also were at one point coordinators of Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, which was, maybe I'm biased, but I would say it was probably the largest and most dynamic grassroots animal liberation campaign there's ever been. Certainly anti-vivisection campaign there's ever been. And with SHAC, we really developed a model of campaigning that was incredibly effective. It was I won't say it's unique, like a lot of the ideas we borrowed from elsewhere and vice versa. But the model we came up with was so effective, really, that the American and British governments were both really terrified that these ideas were going to start populating other social justice movements. And while I don't think any of us necessarily set out to create a blueprint that could end capitalism, I think we probably came dangerously close. I don't think many of us would mind that's what we did, but it was certainly what the governments were scared of. And as a result of that, really, and fears that we were going to drive research and development investment out of the UK, which apparently could have triggered a recession, the government in the UK essentially framed us and set us up on bogus blackmail charges, conspiracy to commit blackmail. And yeah, so I received a 5-year prison sentence for what I would still maintain was ostensibly a lawful campaign.
How much of that did you have to serve in the end?
So I served 2 years in prison. That was probably the easiest bit. There was 3.5 years on bail beforehand. The last year of that, we had to serve an electric tag with curfews. And then after we got released from prison, I had to do another 2.5 years on license, which was probably the toughest bit. I spent 7 months in a hostel, which was predominantly full of sex offenders. And I was told repeatedly that no one is in one of these hostels for more than 3 months. So I was seeing all these, horrible offenders come in and go in, and I was there month after month. So for 7 months, and for that 7 months, I wasn't allowed to talk to my brother, who was also an animal liberation activist. They tried banning me from talking to Nikki, which lasted for 2 weeks, but we got that overthrown. And yeah, so for that period, there's just a constant threat they were going to send me back to prison. Well, whereas when I was in prison, there was nothing worse that could happen. So I could just get on with it and kind of live my life in there. But when I came out, there's just kind of this constant kind of threat of that. So
just hanging over you.
Yeah. So I think I actually found that period harder than being in prison. Yeah. And that all ended really 2015. And so since then, I've been finding my way back into the animal liberation movement. It's a very different environment than what I left, in some ways for the better, in some ways maybe not so much. When we were sent to prison, taken out, it was an orchestrated campaign by the government, particularly led by Lord Sainsbury's, who was the unelected science minister. And I've written a book about all of this, which I'll mention later, but I've got documents that were meant to be redacted of him saying that his intention was to eliminate essentially the anti-vivisection movement, and he succeeded really for a good decade. And so when I got out of prison, the movement I knew didn't exist, and then new groups like the Save Movement, Animal Rebellion, DXE, AV, these the new generation of organizations started forming, and so yeah, I've kind of been finding my way back in and seeing what I can do with my experience and my knowledge and my background to kind of like help them and learn from them and kind of weave the kind of old school grassroots movement hopefully a little bit with the newer generation of activism that's more inspired really from like the environmental movement and things than it is probably by the old animal rights movement.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a fascinating story. And we'll delve back into your thoughts about different modes of activism and so on when we talk about the final big question of how we can make a better world. It would be great to drill into your book too. I guess one other aspect of your intro you haven't mentioned, but which probably doesn't quite fit so well with our agenda here, is your work with tattoos as an artist as well. I don't know if you wanted to touch on that too, or...
Oh yeah, well, yeah. So when I got out of prison, I was essentially banned from talking to any other activists. I think any other vegan, really. I'm sure that was one of my license conditions. So yeah, so like all of my friends, I wasn't allowed to talk to them for the 2.5 years after I got out of prison. And so for that 2.5 years, I kind of wanted. Well, I had to do something. I couldn't do animal rights. I was under surveillance, and yeah, I couldn't talk to my friends. So. And really, I just wanted to kind of convince the police like I'd changed just to kind of get them off my back. So I wanted a job. I didn't realize when I started tattooing as that how time intensive it is, and it kind of has come to dominate my life more than I intended it to. But yes, I'm a tattoo artist now, and that's kind of how I spend my days, stabbing people for money.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and your work is amazing. I'm an amateur in that world, but yeah. So let's come on to these big philosophical questions, and sort of you can lead us through the sort of philosophical journey that led you to the type of work and activism you've done. And the first of those questions is, maybe put in a slightly silly way, what's real? How should we understand reality? And for many guests, it's quite interesting to start with a story about whether they grew up in a sort of religious or a supernatural or a mystical context, or one that was maybe more scientifically minded or naturalistic or atheistic, and how that side of their thinking about the sort of big picture, what is reality and how to become to be here, has changed over time, if it has.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good place to start. It's interesting for me because I actually dropped out of a philosophy degree to do more animal rights activism. So it's kind of nice to kind of come back into this world a little bit. But the family I grew up in, my immediate family weren't religious. I'm kind of tempted to say it was kind of religious nihilism, but that might be going too far. I think my parents would probably identify as atheists, but there was no kind of pressure that like there was no God. So I feel like atheist is probably too far. And then maybe like, because agnosticism is more that there's something. And I don't know if we fit into any of that really. My grandparents were Christian, and it was, I'd say it was good for them. I think there's a lot, they kind of took a lot of positives out of it. They had nice community, and I think it helped them through some tough times and everything. So I saw the positives that can come from religion. But my dad was, by trade, he was a cartographer, and my mum was a psychologist. So I think there was quite a, that kind of cross of mathematics and social science meant that I think my upbringing was really kind of underlined with this idea of addressing issues and tackling problems quite analytically and logically. My mum specifically, I feel like she followed that logic, but would stop and she still does. She stops when she gets to a point that feels uncomfortable, or maybe pushes her to a point where she doesn't really want to know the answer to where this is leading, and she can stop herself. So while I think I inherited or learned that idea of taking problems and thinking through in logical steps, and when I get to a point that I can't answer, then I will stop until I have the knowledge to fill the gap. But I didn't learn when to stop following that logical path. So
just kept going.
Right. And so I was raised to be kind to animals and to respect nature. I was in the young ornithologist club when I was little, and I would go to nature reserves a lot and look at animals and or non-human animals and nature and wildlife. And I was taught to respect it and to value life. But for me, if I'm respecting and valuing life, then I have to respect and value all life. Whereas my mum is able to kind of disassociate and have that kind of cognitive dissonance. I wasn't able to, because the logic takes me over here. And so I think, yeah, that was really where I started coming from these kind of things.
And have you retained that sort of, I guess, default, fairly neutral, naturalistic approach to this day, or have there been aspects where, because this is quite common with people who engage deeply in the animal topic generally, is it can lead them into some areas that do feel more spiritual or transcendent, or there's a sense of oneness or connectedness that goes beyond the physical world. Have you been tempted by anything in that space that isn't religious but is really spiritual or transcendent in some sense, or not so much?
I don't think I have. Obviously, a lot of my friends have in a variety of ways, but I think for me, following that kind of logical kind of sequencing, I'm not someone that would discredit or dismiss anyone's ideas or theories or views or faiths on these things. And I think because there's so many, there's an overwhelming number of very real and very tangible issues that need to be addressed. I think I tend to kind of focus on that. And then for me, whether there's a God or whether there's angels and demons or whether it's fairies or ghosts or anything like that, like maybe, I don't know. But until it impacts me, yeah, it doesn't, it seems unlikely, but I'm not going to go as hard to say it's impossible. And similar with like a lot of things like the flat earth theories and stuff, is I'm not sure how it affects me whether the Earth is flat or round. It's probably round, but who knows? It's not something I'm going to get overly caught up in personally. I think there's a lot of these issues, and I think for me, it following that kind of logical thought processes, it hit a head when I was 9, which maybe is quite young now I think about it. But when I was 9, I went to a there was an organic butcher shop and farm shop quite near to where I grew up in the New Forest. And they also had an abattoir on site. And yeah, it was, but I didn't know that as a 9-year-old. All I knew was that there was a petting zoo outside and I got to go and play with the pigs with my brother. So we used to play with these 2 potbelly pigs and spend our time there with them while my dad was going in and buying his meat and whatever. And obviously at that age, there is that kind of cognitive dissonance. Like I'm playing with a pig, he's buying meat. Those are 2 unrelated events. And one Christmas, he called me inside. It was like, Tom, come in. There's mince pies in here. And, I like mince pies. So I kind of toddled inside to 9-year-olds toddle. I don't know, but I made my way inside.
I think I still toddled when I was 9. Yeah.
And there was just these skinned pigs everywhere and braces of pheasants hanging up and rabbits hanging up. And, this is when I was 9. I'm 40 now. So that's good. That's quite a while to kind of hold this very vivid image. And 31 years later, I still vividly recall what it was like in there. It was kind of like that moment in the second Ace Ventura film when he goes into that hunting trophy room and just the room of death. And it was just these skinned pigs. And I think specifically because there were skinned pigs and because my 2 favorite animals in the petting zoo were pigs, I immediately made that connection. I was like, wait a minute, I was playing with his brother outside or some relation of his, even if it's like a distant one. And just in that moment as a 9-year-old, I think something in me kind of, I'm going to say it snapped, but probably broke, to be honest. And I went home in silence. And when I got home, I kind of declared to my family that I wasn't going to eat meat anymore. And in hindsight, I think a lot more of me changed that day than I kind of realized. It wasn't just like this dietary change. It was from that moment, I think I started questioning what I was being told on quite a deep and profound level because I just didn't trust authority. I didn't trust my parents. I didn't trust anything I've been told. I needed the answers myself. I wasn't going to accept what people were telling me because it didn't match. And I started getting in trouble in school a bit, generally doing things that I felt were right, but that the teachers didn't think were right. And
it's a fascinating link between, I guess, this epistemology question and the ethics question, because I think I'd share your approach to the epistemology stuff in a way of just like, we should be open-minded even to weird stuff because we know that quite a lot of weird stuff is actually true, right? I mean, if anyone's even had a cursory reading of modern physics, there's some deeply weird stuff going on. So open-mindedness is important. But as you said, resisting the temptation when we're uncertain to make stuff up, just be okay, be uncertain. And if you're interested, go find out. And if you're not, that's fine. But the other thing you talked about was this, again, I think it's quite a compassionate approach of like, look, you can believe what you like, you can have your own values, that's all fine. But it implied that you were, that's a free and open space and people should believe what they want. But when it starts to have an impact, then we can have an ethical stance. And in a way, what you experienced at 9 years old is sort of a very brutal example of that, because it wasn't just like an ethical awakening, right? You didn't suddenly decide to care about pigs. It was actually a new piece of knowledge, right? You saw something that had been hidden from you, and that had the impact on the way you think about the world.
Yeah, 100%. And like I said, I think it changed my entire worldview. It wasn't a small change. I think I fundamentally changed as a person on that day. And I think that's impacted everything since. And I think that's why through my activism and things like that, like I've been inside abattoirs, I've been inside laboratories. I have to experience this and I have to do something about it because I know, and I kind of feel almost like burdened with this knowledge that I have to do something because a lot of other people don't know or don't care.
And I will let you come on to the big questions of ethics now. But just before we move off the epistemology thing, the other point you mentioned was really interesting, which is it sparked a deep distrust in you about things you were being told by authorities, those in power, and so on. And in the current age, although I think it's true of all ages, right, there is this challenge because there are some people who unquestioningly accept institutions and authorities and go along with it. Sometimes because it's in their own interests, and sometimes because their just way of thinking has been corralled and structured. So they have no skepticism or very little skepticism about institutions. There's also, I think, a risk where people can go the other way, that where they abandon all trust in every form of institution or every form of authority. And the sort of jokey version of it online is the people who claim they do their own research, which in reality means they've just watched some random grifter on YouTube who's selling them supplements and an online course, right? So I guess there are those two extremes: total untrusting, compliance with authority, and then such a deep level of distrust in any form of authority or institutions that you almost abandon them completely. And that can lead you into some very strange places in terms of knowledge and belief. That can also have harms. How do you think about that sort of space of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy? Because in a way, people like you and me who take non-human animal ethics seriously, I think we're almost at more danger of that conspiracism because we are in a minority. The most of humanity has been hoodwinked into believing things that just aren't true by very powerful forces. So once you've seen that and it is actually true, it's quite easy to think that might be happening in every other space too. But I don't know what you think about that sort of challenge as well.
I mean, I kind of agree, but I also think those two extremes are almost the same thing. Like, it's having blind faith in someone. So whether you're having blind faith in a government and the pharmaceutical industry or whoever on that side, or you're having blind faith in some guy on the internet, like it's the same thing. And
that's a good point. Yeah.
Our society is bizarre. Like modern Western capitalism is a really bizarre system. And it's, most of the problems we're kind of facing are a result of it, of prioritizing capital over people. And whether they're human people or otherwise. And living in this society, we have to kind of accept a lot of very strange things that don't really make sense. And if you follow things logically like I do, it's very bizarre. Like when I was in prison, something that really struck me was on my wing we had 100, like, well, I don't know, like 400 like grown men who were meant to be like, hardened criminals, many of them. And yet at 8 o'clock every night, 2 officers would come on the landing and shout behind your doors, and all these hardened criminals just voluntarily step into a little box and let them. And every single night I was like, I don't understand. Why are we not resisting this at all? Like, there's 2 of them. Like, even if it's just to symbolically, why are we all just okay with this? And then that extends very clearly into society. Like, we have our legal system. I think virtually anyone you speak to just accepts that politicians are corrupt. We just accept it. Like, oh yeah, they're all bad, aren't they? Oh, let's go and vote for some more. And it's why do we accept that? Why do we accept
tragic? Yeah.
That 40% of our prime ministers went to the same school? Like, no prime ministers went to my school. Why do we accept this? Why do we accept the existence?
There's still time, Tom. There's still time.
There is. But yeah, why do we accept the existence of billionaires? Why don't we just go and take their stuff? Like, I don't get it. I genuinely don't get it. And so I think living in this society where you just, to be a member of it, you have to just accept madness and just really illogical things. I think then it's no wonder that when we're kind of thrown these alternatives to that, however wild they might be, people kind of grasp onto them because we can't trust the government. We know we can't trust the government. So what do we do about it? Well, either we kind of knuckle down and pull our sleeves up and get on with some really dirty and hard work to sort it out, or we just go on Facebook and social media and complain about things that don't really matter. We can kind of portray ourselves as activists without actually doing any activism, without any real risk. Because, if you go and confront the pharmaceutical industry genuinely over genuine issues, look what happened to me. But if you're, like complaining that Bill Gates is injecting us with microchips and then trying to cull the elderly or whatever, there's no real repercussions to that because except for being labeled as, like a lunatic or whatever, like, slurs that are thrown that way. I think, and the people that do get those slurs often are fine with it because they've kind of convinced themselves they have a higher knowledge, and therefore whatever kind of lesser people say about them doesn't matter because I'm enlightened and you're not. So what do you know? Call me what you want.
Yeah, there's a convincing narrative and a select group of sources that I will trust, and anybody else's resistance is evidence that we're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it doesn't surprise me that that's a thing. I think, and then on top of that, as you say, there are, conspiracies are real. Like governments do terrible, terrible things, and a lot of it isn't even cloak and dagger. A lot of it is very overt and in the open, and we've just been kind of conditioned to accept it.
Yeah, I mean there are real conspiracies, and I don't know what the word for it is, but because the definition of conspiracy normally means it's a group of people doing something bad in secret. But what do we call it when it's actually quite open and proud and
Democracy?
maybe? Well, and I want to come back to that with you in our final question again, but that sort of prefigured it beautifully. But tell us the rest of this story about how you're, because we'll come on to these questions about what matters and who matters now, and you've already hinted at some of that journey. But even as a child, like you said, you were sort of connected with non-human animals and thinking about respect for life, the ornithology stuff, the experience with the pigs when you were 9. How did that play out? Because many people, and myself included, will criticize anthropocentrism, this sense that humans are the center of moral concern and maybe even all that matters. But one of the weird things about most humans is that almost every human already breaks anthropocentrism to some degree, right? There are some non-humans they care about, sometimes very deeply. And that might involve companion animals. It might involve certain selected species. It might involve certain particularly charismatic wild animals. It might involve animals that are in certain settings. So some people might be concerned about animals farmed for fur, but not those farmed for food, or animals farmed for food, but not those in laboratories under certain settings as well. So there are so many different barriers that we've got to work through if you want to get to a genuinely universal, what you might call a sentiocentric compassion. What was the rest of your journey through that? But also, how did it play through practically? Because you said at 9 you didn't want to eat meat, but what were the other sort of practical steps, and how did that feel socially for you as you tried to put that stuff into practice?
There's something that you said at the beginning of it that I kind of want to address, and then I'll get onto the second bit, and that is about the anthropocentrism, and for me where that comes from. And I guess that, again, this kind of comes back to the kind of logical thinking of things, but I've always been fascinated by people, particularly when we do things that I find intriguing, and religion for me is a part of that. Like I find religion genuinely fascinating, like how people are prepared to put everything into something that very well might not be real. And in many cases I understand that. Like I say, my grandparents understood it was good for them, and people suffering through atrocities, like people in Palestine, I certainly wouldn't criticize them wanting to have faith in something better than what they're enduring. So but a lot of it I find intriguing, and obviously I grew up in the UK, obviously, and so Christianity is supposedly the dominant religion here. I don't think we have one anymore, but Christianity is the dominant religion here. And
I think the latest census says something like, I think it was 51% of people now say they are non-religious.
Yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily mean that much, because that's a big bucket, but it does mean that less than half people explicitly say they're religious. But within that, Christianity is still the biggest of the religious groupings. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find it fascinating because the New Testament, the earliest parts of the New Testament were written hundreds of years after Jesus died. And then obviously all of it has been massively edited and misinterpreted and retranslated and mistranslated. And then obviously when the Romans kind of got hold of Christianity, they omitted a lot, they added a lot, and changed a lot. And so obviously the texts we have now are nothing like what the early Christians kind of put down. But what I think, something that I find fascinating about society and interplaying with religion is really, I think, the damage that Genesis has done to society. And I think that there's kind of a few strands of it, but the clear ones to me are firstly this idea that man was made in God's image. And so obviously all the kind of early followers of the Abrahamic religions, for them reading that meant they were made in God's image. So when they came across people that didn't look like them, they couldn't have been made in God's image because how many images can God have? And so
and again, it's a sort of reassuring narrative that puts me in an important place. That feels good, right?
And so, it's very clear in like early white colonialism that was a huge factor of it. You would come across someone with a different skin tone and you would say, well, you can't be Christian because you're not white.
Yeah, your image doesn't match.
Right. Yeah. And so really like, the colonial mindset and the really systemic racism comes from that idea that from white settlers, white Europeans, that we are made in God's image and therefore no one else can be. And therefore they can't be good Christians and therefore they're expendable, which has obviously had huge ramifications throughout history and continues to. And then on top of that, you have this idea that Eve was created purely for Adam's benefit. Like women were created for the pleasure of men and no other purpose. And again, that just feeds through history, particularly like Christian and a lot of religious or Abrahamic religious history, that women are secondary to men and really exist for the benefit of men. And that's the basis of the patriarchy. And then further to that, we have
and also the fact that it was all her fault in the first place with the tree of knowledge. Going after knowledge is a bad thing, and can you really trust them, right? Again, I don't want to play too many messages, but these things are really deep seated. They echo through, right? They still have an influence.
And it's important. And further to that, we obviously have this idea of human supremacy, that non-human animals were created by God for humans. And that idea, I think, has caused so much harm for non-human animals and our interaction with them, and then really our toxic interaction with the natural world. And humans forget consistently, even animal rights activists, I see it all the time. We forget that we're animals. And, I see animal rights activists saying things like, oh, like animals are better than humans. I say, but that's a paradoxical statement. We can't be better than what we are. It doesn't make sense. And I think reinforcing that separation is so harmful. Like we need to be like closing that gap and reminding people that we are animals too. And scientifically, there's not really any field of science which would say that animals or non-human animals experience the world in a wildly different way to how we do. And so that ingrained idea that humans are necessarily better than other animals and more important. And you see it because obviously when we talk about religion, and it's kind of religion versus science, but then you look at science and you look at like animal research, and that entire field is just draped in this idea, this religious dogma, that humans are superior to other animals, therefore we can do what we like with them in a laboratory. And to call that science when we also have biological science, evolutionary science, telling us that that's just not true, is a perversion. And really animal research is probably one of the few fields of science that hasn't actually changed at all in 100 years. But other fields of science rely upon it and refer to it and defer to it. And it is kind of hard for me to watch that when I see scientists talking about something in very thinly veiled religious terms.
It's deeply bizarre, isn't it? Because it is, many of these people, have very visibly and clearly rejected a religious or a supernatural worldview. Some are quite dismissive and rude about it, and have clearly set their stall out in a different direction. As you say, we're not religious, we're scientific, we might be humanists, we might be atheists, we might be skeptics, we might be, whatever we are, right? We're in opposition to dogma and fideism and revelation and these other sort of non-fact-based ways of knowing. What we do is relentlessly driven by evidence and reason. Yet those themes are like hangovers from a religious worldview. And there are so many of them. It's like, deference to an ultimate authority, morality to be meaningful has to be defined as some sort of objective external thing. It's not something we can just create for ourselves. The anthropocentrism, the sexism, the way people use some of those tropes to exclude other groups of humans, let alone non-human animals. It's fascinating psychologically and socially. As you say, these are people who claim they've moved away from a religious worldview, but it still seeps through so much of their thinking.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's I find it fascinating and also deeply disturbing, and it's very frustrating, really, when you're trying to have arguments about logic and reason, and people drop back to, if you ask a vivisector, why is it okay to test on an animal, a non-human animal? Why is it okay to test on a mouse or a rabbit or a dog? And the answer will have this very thinly veiled hint of religion about it. It will be because they're not human.
And the link between certain types of humans being in the image of God and those other humans don't match that image. So that's one motivator for exclusionary intrahuman ethics. But you also talked about how the way we think about animals links to exclusion of human outgroups as well, and that by referring to a human outgroup as somehow being animalistic, and there are so many horrific examples throughout history and today, frankly, memes you could pick up this afternoon on Twitter, which will be doing this directly, using a classification of an animality to derogate other humans, to dehumanize, is a disgusting thing. But as you say, many people, even in the animal space, their reaction is to try and reject that by saying, no, we are, we are different. We are. And I'm not all the way through it at the moment, but I'm reading Aphro-ism by Sil Ko. And it's quite a mind-blowing book, because one of the themes that runs through that is that, yes, there might be this anthropocentric thing that's come from a sort of religious made in the image of God, but they're also talking about the very concept of animality being something that then drives intrahuman discrimination. So the very fact that category exists then enables that sort of human discrimination. And to echo what you said, that the very definition of the word human doesn't mean all Homo sapiens. It means a special subset of humans that happen to look like and sound like and act like us in my in-group. So the very existence of this human-animal divide, that, by the way, doesn't actually map onto species whatsoever, then enables one, catastrophic harm of non-human animals, but also catastrophic harm of Homo sapiens that don't fit the human, template that we want to privilege.
I think something I've often struggled with. There's a word that is certainly missing from my lexicon, and maybe you can enlighten me if this word exists. But we often get criticized for anthropomorphizing non-human animals, whereas the reality, I think, is and for want of a better word, we dehumanize non-human animals, and I don't know what the word would be. And I think the fact that I don't know that word and potentially doesn't exist kind of highlights this issue that we're just not prepared to accept that other animals might be similar to us.
Yeah, it's as if the only way we could recognize the value of non-human animals is to give them human characteristics, right? And elevate them to our level.
Yeah, so people, will criticize you for kind of like letting your dog sleep on a bed. It's like, but I'm sure all wild animals would like a comfortable bed. That's not like we like it. If we like it, why wouldn't they like it? We're animals too. I'm very intrigued if that word does exist. And if
I'm not sure. I've toyed with the idea of, instead of anthropocentrism, of centrism or something like that, where or sentiomorphism, where but you do it in an appropriate way, where you'd say, look, I'm not inappropriately saying, this other being has these human characteristics. You're appropriately using a naturalistic approach to assess the degree of, to assess the sentience of all sorts of beings, human and non-human.
When we look at the intelligence of other animals, when humans can study the intelligence of other animals, we go in again with this kind of quasi-religious mindset. We go in with this predefined bar of what intelligence is, but what humans have decided intelligence is based upon what made humans seemingly different from other animals like a few hundred years ago. And that's what intelligence is. And so now for any other species to be deemed as intelligent by humans, we have to discover new things about them that make them more like us, rather than just scrapping this whole idea that it's our differences that define intelligence, and actually just looking objectively at what is intelligence.
We've come up with a standard, which is us. and everybody else must measure to that.
But it's not even what's us, it's what makes us different from them.
Yeah.
And then somehow they need to like do things to prove that they're more like us. And it's like, well, actually, like if we just objectively look at this, there's all kinds of, and there's probably things that humans don't do that other animals do. There's vastly more intelligent than a lot of things we do. Can't use echolocation.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, that was fascinating. Thank you. But the other part of my crazy compound question was this, again, your sort of personal journey to working this stuff out, and how far does your moral scope go now? And what was it like putting that into practice at sort of 9 years old onwards?
So I think at 9 I went vegetarian. I think that was the big thing that happened then. And then, like I say, I kind of, I always did well at school. I'm pretty sure I've got ADHD, so I didn't probably do as well as people expected me to, but I started getting in trouble for defending myself or defending other people. And again, I think, I did that because I had this kind of distrust of authority, but also then that reinforced this distrust of authority, because every time I stood up for someone, I would then get punished for it.
And you were clear that it was the moral thing to do, but the authorities were punishing you anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, the kind of grey areas of morality, legality, the right and wrong, I think they kind of got blurred for me fairly young as a result. So I was 13 when I started listening to punk music. My brother introduced me to it, and that was something that connected with me because, there's a diversity of politics, but there's a lot of things that are very humanist and very radical and progressive. And so this kind of raw energy music that was about making the world better and doing something really literally sung to me. And I think I was 15 when I heard about the straight edge movement in America, which was a subsection of the hardcore scene that was about not drinking, not smoking, not doing drugs, and often being politically active. And again, that kind of spoke to me as a 15-year-old. I read about it in a Kerrang magazine, a heavy metal magazine. As a kid, when I was 13, I started drinking and smoking and smoking pot and stuff. And because it felt rebellious, and I felt like I was being I was doing something and I was kind of kicking back against the system. But by the time I was 15 and I read this article, it was like I was bored of it. I'd kind of grown out. All my friends were drinking. They all smoked. There was nothing rebellious about it anymore.
Yeah. Everyone's rebelling in the same way. Yeah.
Right. There was no and certainly by the time I got to 18, I'd have probably given up anyway, because it was like there's no rebellion now. It's just socially normal. So when I heard about these kids in America that were flicking cigarettes out of people's mouths and letting animals out of laboratories, and I was like, this is amazing. This really speaks. I don't know who these people are. This was before the internet was a big thing, and I identified with those people more than I identified with my friends at school, because I was the only person that listened to punk anyway, and my friends, we didn't share that. We skated together, and that was kind of it. Whereas these other kids that I probably would never meet, they were taking direct action to save animals and to save lives. And the kind of silly stuff of knocking drinks out of people's hands I found it amusing, but it didn't. it wasn't really part of it. And so growing up in a small town in the UK, me and my brother, we both went straight edge at the same time. And I think we kind of created our own version of what straight edge meant. Obviously, there's the kind of basic tenets of, not drinking, not smoking, not doing drugs, promiscuous sex and things like that. But I think we had record sleeves, we had fanzines, we had books that we kind of pulled together this quite romantic version of it, I think, that was about dumpster diving and jumping trains and shoplifting and attending protests and doing sneaking around at night doing direct action for animal liberation, human liberation. And yeah, it was quite a kind of weirdly kind of anarchically idyllic kind of way of living that really kind of went to our core, and it said a lot about who we were.
And was the animal question core to that from the start for you? Because as I understand it, it's pretty common within straight edge communities, but it's not always super present.
Yeah, the animal liberation was I believe in animal liberation before I got into that, really, and it was that side of it that this article was was talking about. There was, it's the it's like the Green Scare case now, but at the time, that those people, the ELF activists, hadn't been caught for those things. So this article was about the releasing the horses from the ranch and burning the ranch down. It was about the Vail ski resort where they burnt in Colorado. They burnt down the ski resort to protect the wild lynx habitat, and it was about was it the University of Minnesota that got raided by the Animal Liberation Front in a very kind of movie style. It was a very incredible footage, and so that was what spoke to me more. That the other stuff was kind of silly, and I found it amusing but like it was this for me. This was about being a clear-headed kind of revolutionary. Like you can't take effective action if you're not with it. And it was about being the best version of me, and it felt more rebellious. Like this felt like a true rebellion. This was standing up against this societal norm of drinking. Like everyone drinks, like literally everyone, and it's weird not to. Like less so now probably, but certainly through my teenage years and my 20s, I was constantly like, why don't you drink? How do you have fun without drinking? So it felt rebellious to not be drinking.
And was not drinking more or less socially challenging than vegetarianism and veganism? Did they feel like a similar sort of thing, or were they the social pressure?
It's a weird thing for me personally. I don't know if I'm the best person to ask, just because I didn't really like anyone at school. I had a few kind of friends, but like
that's one way of mitigating social pressure, yeah.
Right. So I grew up in a very small town. I had a mohawk. I had like bondage trousers and the works, and I didn't fit in at school. So I was friends with the kind of alternative kids that were kind of listen to Nirvana or whatever, because that's the closest I had. But as soon as I left school, I kind of got a new friendship group, and so when I went to college, people met me as, at the time, vegetarian, but as a vegetarian straight edge punk kid, and that's how they met me. So if they liked that, they liked that. If they didn't, well, there's plenty of other people I can be friends with. So it's never really been a huge issue either way. Like the drinking, the people, just that's who I am. But the not drinking and everything, like I don't care if people drink. Like just genuinely don't care. Do what you want. It's your body. Do what you want. For me, this feels like it's being the best version of me, and that's what I want. If you want something else for yourself, that's absolutely fine. Veganism, not being vegan is selfish. Like it's inherently so. I do care if people are vegan, because people are dying because you're not. So
it impacts others, yeah.
Right. So for me, like I think probably I probably got asked more questions really about not drinking than being vegetarian in a way. But I was happier to be asked questions about the vegetarianism and then veganism, because these are things that I want you to go vegetarian vegan. And I actually had quite a good hit rate when I talk to people. I think at one point at college we had probably about 20 vegans like in our kind of social group, and it was a college in the middle of the New Forest, and this was the end of the 90s. So
yeah,
do you know what I mean?
It was pretty good going, yeah.
Quite something, and yeah, so those kind of questions, I enjoyed them, and I enjoyed talking to people about it and seeing people change. And I changed because someone spoke to. I had an argument with a well, I didn't have an argument. I had a discussion with a 6-year-old who convinced me to go vegan eventually.
Oh, really? That's pretty impressive.
So me and my brother, when we were going kind of in this kind of straight edge phase, and we were like 15, when I was 15, he was 18, we would go around our local town, pick up stickers. We would like de-lock up the local fishing lakes with the fishermen inside, and we went to raid our local mink farm when I was 15, and we were in like full camo gear, sat in this tree with binoculars, until one of us realized it was the middle of winter. So literally everyone for about a mile could see us, just sat there with our balaclavas on, and we aborted that idea. But so we started making ourselves out. It was very kind of like this kind of DIY kind of punky idea that we could just do things, and I'm kind of glad I kind of grew up with that concept, because I think that stuck with me. But yeah, so I met my local animal rights group at that mink farm, actually, on a protest there. I'd made friends with him, and one of the coordinators, he had 3 children that had been raised vegetarian. Him and his wife were vegan, but they'd raised their kids vegetarian because they, this was like the end of the 90s, and they didn't want to be seen to be pressuring their children to do it. They wanted to give them that choice. But these kids grew up in an animal rights household, so they had all these leaflets everywhere, and they started asking their parents, why aren't we vegan? Like, why do you get to be vegan and we don't? And so they chose. And so this girl was Sarah. She was 6 when she chose to go vegan. She may have even been a bit younger when she actually went vegan, but yeah, they chose that at that age. And I attended a protest with them, and I was I think 16 at the time, and she was asking why I was wearing leather shoes. They were boots that I think I had no money. I'd stolen them from an army surplus shop. So they were like leather boots. And she was asking, well, why are you wearing leather? Like you wouldn't wear human skin. And I was like, oh, they're secondhand. It was like, would you wear secondhand human skin? And I was like, well, probably not. No. And she started asking these questions. Why do you eat eggs? Why do you drink milk? And I was like, I don't have an answer. And I think it occurred to me pretty quickly if I can't win an argument with a 6-year-old, then I'm probably wrong.
And given the sort of person you were, who was sort of willing to follow the thinking to wherever it leads, even if it's uncomfortable.
Right. And I think I knew I wanted to be vegan anyway, to be honest, because I lived with my parents and they did all my cooking, they bought all my food. I think I felt a little bit trapped that, I was already pushing them enough. And that was the biggest obstacle. But yeah, when I had this discussion with Sarah when she was 6, I kind of, again, I kind of went home and I was like, do you know what? Like, a 6-year-old is absolutely right and I'm absolutely wrong. So I pretty much went vegan straight away after that.
That's amazing.
I've already been going out hunt sabbing with the local hunt sab group and stuff since I was like 16. So it took 2 years of real full-time activism before I went vegan.
That's amazing that a 6-year-old could, but I mean, I'm lucky enough to do quite a lot of sort of workshops in schools around different worldviews and ways of thinking. But I'm continuously blown away by how brilliant young kids are. I think they're better at philosophy than most adults, to be honest, because they haven't yet been trained into, what's normal. So the freshness of the questions and the directness of the thinking is, So in a way, it's not that surprising that a 6-year-old could have persuaded you. So
no, it's not. And I think there is, like you say, there is kind of a purity and an innocence to the questions that the younger people ask because like they haven't been ground down with what is normal. And I think we often just kind of accept things because it's normal. It's what we're told is normal. And so a lot of people I know Nikki, where my partner, when she went vegetarian, it was because when she was a kid, she drove past a field of cows and her mum, she was like, what's that? And her mum was like, oh, that's beef. And she was like, what? Like, what? And like to adult, that's just normal. Yeah, that's the field of beef cows. But to a child, it's like, well, wait a minute, if that's beef and that what? There is a lot to be said, I think, for that kind of we kind of erode our brains, I think, as we accept what's normal.
Yeah, often the case. So before I let you come off this philosophy stuff, there's another aspect that I find really interesting. So, like I say, sentientism as a worldview is super pluralistic. It's very broad. It says every sentient being should get moral consideration, have compassion from us. But that leaves a lot of space for how you put that into practice. And there's so much we could explore there. But one interesting angle is, I guess it comes back to this ultimate what matters question. If we think all sentient beings matter, okay, what is it about them that matters, and how should we try and act with in consideration of them as beings, as others? And there's loads of different ways, but two include, one is, they are sentient beings. They have their own perspectives. They have their own interests. They value things in a certain way. They presumably want to live. They want to be reasonably free from suffering. They want to be unconstrained. They want to live with their families. So in a way, it's about the quality of their experiences that matters. Their suffering, their flourishing, their pain, their love, their happiness. It's the experiences, their momentary sentience really that counts. There's another stance which is more focused on liberation. And you talked about, animal liberation being a central thing for you earlier on, which is a bit different in that it says ultimately it's about autonomy and freedom that matters, not so much whether there's suffering going on. And many people will think about these in different ways. So some people will say, look, the reason I care about other human and non-human animals being free and being liberated is because that's good for their experiences of life. It's good for their flourishing. Others will say, liberation matters independently and almost more, it matters more than suffering. And I guess where that can lead to, one interesting case study is how we think about, yes, farmed animals and animals in labs and under our control, because there I think both of those philosophies would lead us to say, we need to transition to end these things, to liberate the animals, but also to end their suffering and their exploitation, right? These things all go together. But when you look at the very challenging case of thinking about wild animals, who are also sentient beings, there you get a really big difference, because there are some people who say, look, we should care about the suffering of animals in the wild, and maybe there are things we should do about that. And again, that's a massively complex question in its own right. Where there are others who will say, no, it's just about liberation. And sometimes that focus comes from an understandable horror at what humanity has done to non-human animals. So the end goal there is not about the flourishing of all sentient beings. It's just humans just need to get out of the way and liberate. And then that's it. And then humanity, get back in your box, do what you got to do, but just walk away, please, because what you've done is horrific. So I don't know, I've laid out too much there, but what's your sense? How do you think about liberation versus suffering and flourishing, and also about, wild animal ethics as a space?
Just to like kind of bracket myself, I always refer to myself as an animal liberation activist, not an animal rights activist, because the concept of rights, I think the person receiving those rights, like when we decide what human rights are, we have a kind of vested interest in that, and we can decide what rights we need to live the way that we feel best for us. So the idea that of animal rights, I know the argument is that they're kind of an inherent thing, but they can't be. They always have to be kind of decided upon and kind of gifted by someone. Like,
yeah, by somebody who has power and therefore some supposed privilege to
and
grant.
Nothing to kind of gain from them having them. So it's kind of sits a bit uncomfortable in this idea that we get to decide what rights other animals have to live on their own planet. And so for that reason, I bracket myself an animal liberation activist, because I just want us to leave them alone. But obviously we need to interject between humans that don't think that and non-human animals. I think you said something about momentary sentience, and I quite like that, because I think my kind of core philosophy, I've been told this is quite depressing, but I don't think it is. I think it's quite a positive philosophy, but others disagree. But I believe, I think it's fairly likely that at some point our planet won't exist anymore, whether it's induced by humans or whether it's the sun imploding or exploding or an asteroid hitting us. At some point we won't exist anymore. And
at some point, yeah.
At some point, and when that happens, in the moment that the life on Earth is extinguished, and possibly considerably before that, when human life is extinguished, everything we've created on this planet won't matter. Like every piece of art, every great sonnet, every piece of literature, every movie, it won't matter. Like it's gone forever. And so for me, what will matter in that moment is the moments of joy and freedom and those kind of base positive emotions. They will have mattered in the moment that they existed. And that's kind of my philosophy. And therefore, I see my role as bringing as many of those moments of joy as possible to myself and to those around me, whether I know them or not, whether they're human or not. And kind of by extension of that, I believe that it's our moral imperative, it's our obligation, our duty to use the minimum force necessary to prevent harm and to initiate those moments of joy and freedom. And more kind of succinctly, I think for me, it's what's the minimum I have to do to be able to look myself in the mirror and sleep soundly at night, which is probably more than I do, more than anyone does. But yeah, I think that's kind of my kind of core philosophy on it. And I think that kind of brings together the both of what you were saying a little bit. I think we need to be creating these moments of joy, and we also need to be ensuring that other animals aren't impacted by humans at all. Like, whether it's like ethically or not, we just need to kind of let them get on with it. They don't need us. They don't want us. Like every other species would flourish without humans. And the same probably isn't true the other way around.
No, I like it. And I agree that's a positive stance, right? Or valuing the momentary sentience, because again, I think it's another one of these maybe religious hangovers where some people, even non-religious people, seem to think that you have to have some cosmic scoreboard at the end of the game which has the marks on it for anything to count. It's like, do you people think that going to the cinema only matters if you give it a 5-star review at the end? No, you enjoy every moment of your sentient experience as you're going through that process. You don't need some, ultimate final score. Who gives a shit? So I quite like that stance. And I also appreciate and I think it's a very positive motivation that we should want to liberate and to get out of the way, I guess. And I think you're probably right that non-human animals generally just don't want us to intervene or to get involved. But at the same time, I can imagine, partly because of my naturalistic view of, what living in the wild is, and Darwinian processes are amoral and brutal, and there is no doubt a lot of joy in the wild, but there's also a lot of catastrophic suffering, that if a non-human animal had the capacity to understand the potential for humans to intervene, and maybe it had an illness that there was a vaccine for, or if it was starving and we had the capability to give it food, and this gets even more contentious, if it was being chased by a predator and maybe we could, give the predator a Beyond Burger or something instead, so they'd both be happy. In that hypothetical sense, or I think the animal probably would want us to intervene. So that takes me into being a little bit more open about, are there things we could do for wild animals that go beyond just liberating and getting out of the way? And it's a weird space because it's one of those worlds where I find that the average human is more open to intervening in some way in the wild than most animal advocates and animal activists and animal liberationists, because we're so understandably skeptical of human intervention whatsoever that we, the instinct is often just get out of the way. Whereas there's local community groups around here who will eat animals 3 times a day. But if a fox is injured by a car, the outpouring of wanting to help, or even that's a slightly different situation, right? Because the harm has been done by a human. But if there's an ill wild animal that's not been harmed by humans at all, right? A pure liberationist stance might say, well, stand back and let them die. But these people out here are, how can we help? Let's get them to a sanctuary. Let's feed them. Let's put them in a cardboard box at home. It's a tricky space, but a fascinating dynamic socially as well, where
the idea of bringing these moments of joy, like for me, that entirely extends. It's not just farmed animals; it entirely extends to wild animals. And I also think we have to consider the sick fox, for example. Why is it sick?
Yeah,
is it entirely naturally sick, or has it become sick because of human incursion into its territory? And I think a lot of the time when we come across issues in the wild, a lot of those issues, obviously predator-prey situations, not so much, but a lot of these situations are created by an overabundance of humans.
Yeah, and we're already intervening at massive scale, whether we like it or not, right? So
there's probably not like an inch of at least the surface of this planet that hasn't been impacted by human activity. And I think we again have those obligations, and it takes me a little bit back to what I was saying earlier about the dog wanting to be on the comfy bed and this idea of the anthropomorphizing. I think if I left a Temper mattress in my garden, I'd probably find like some foxes curled up in there in the morning.
Absolutely, yeah.
We forget that a lot of our kind of base instincts to have like sanctuary and warmth and safety and security and food and water, all animals want that.
Yeah.
And so the luxuries that, not
because we share so much evolutionary history, right? Of course, right? We are animals too. Yeah.
And so not letting your dog on the sofa, like why? You would let your child on the sofa, and what's the difference? And then why does that not extend to other animals, wild animals? Obviously, then you start going down a little bit down this kind of rabbit hole that a lot of kind of Lex Luthor-y type philanthropists go down, where we start like creating mosquitoes that will like get rid of the tsetse virus and stuff, which then everything starts getting very uncomfortable, and we start having these impacts, GM crops and things that then release these horrible things out into the wild that then end up having a much worse impact than actually. And so I think for me,
requires some real prudence.
If you see an injured animal, then help it. Like, to me, that's just common sense, human or otherwise. But we shouldn't be doing things that is playing God with the world, because that's what we do, and it's terrible. And not just in terms of directly with other animals, but just technology in general. We create the airplane, and then we just make it into this massively available like thing that's killing our planet. we just release it en masse without thinking what are the consequences of this, and we do it over and over and over again. Like, the internet, we create the internet, and it has all these positive things, and social media has all these positive things, but we just release it without thinking it through. Like, what are the bad things? Like what is this going to have in terms of, like into human abuse and all the other things that can come with the internet, and we don't think it through. We just, oh, this is a good idea, let's just do it. And I think that's kind of the human approach, and that's why I would be reticent to have any large scale involvement in the wild.
You slip back into hubris, and
although we need to reconnect with the wild and become more wild ourselves, I think.
Yeah. So let's come on to, in the time we've got left available, the final crazily big question is, how do we make a better world? And you've been talking about that already, because you've been talking about, I guess, your lifetime's work in activism, and you already laid out the principle of using the minimal force possible to, I guess, reduce suffering or take animals, prevent harm, and to enable flourishing in some sense. So that's sort of laid out that stance. And it's obviously core to your book too. And in a way, your title is a great way of framing one of the classical challenges in activism in this space, because we are all brought up in a world that is very ready to think about the ethical limits of activism. Follow the law, do what you're told, use the processes, vote, do these types of things, right? So there's a sort of inbuilt assumption that you should be quite polite and you shouldn't break rules when you're doing your activism. And, without getting too overtly political, our current government seems to only want activism that no one notices, which seems to undermine the point of activism. Yeah, it's odd, that, isn't it? Anyway, let's not go there too much. So there's this thing about, right, activism should be bounded and polite and follow the rules, blah, blah, blah. But then when you set that against the ethical imperative that the activists are trying to look at, the title of your book is Your Neighbour Kills Puppies, right? So when you lay out that story and the ethical imperative that I think almost every human would feel, it butts up against this, oh, but by the way, your activism should be polite, follow the rules, and use the institutions. How have you come to frame that challenge? Because particularly in the non-human animal space, the ethical imperative is searing and egregious and overwhelming. And if these things were being done to other humans, people would take many of the limits off activism and say, look, you do whatever the fuck it takes, right, to stop this thing happening. But when it's non-humans, it's all back to, oh no, you must be polite and limit. But at the same time, there are some types of more extreme activism that might actually have negative effects. And so, anyway, I should stop talking. What's your big picture view of activism, direct activism, and how those trade-offs play out?
I remember seeing a documentary about the Animal Liberation Front when I first got involved in activism, and there was a quote from Ronnie Lee where they questioned him about being an extremist. And he said that when you look at what's happening to non-human animals in abattoirs and in factory farms, in laboratories, the actions of the Animal Liberation Front are actually really lenient rather than being in any way extreme. And that really resonated with me and stuck with me, because it's true. Like, that I don't think, people kind of say, oh, you shouldn't do this kind of activism because you're stooping to their level. But unless we're murdering people by their millions, billions in some cases, how are we anywhere near their level? And so that's kind of why I kind of stick with it, this idea of using the minimum force necessary. Because, if I see someone punching a dog or kicking a dog, then the minimum force to prevent that might simply be going, can you not do that? And explaining to them why it's not okay, and what the dog must be feeling. And potentially they might suddenly have an epiphany and become a less terrible person. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe I need to grab the dog and run off with it. And then maybe the person will attack me and I need to defend myself and the dog from that. And so,
and almost nobody would object to you doing that.
Exactly. And so what the minimum force necessary will depend on the situation, and it can escalate to having to use more force. And my personal line is hurting innocent people. I mean, that's always been a very basic. I'm certainly not a pacifist. I don't think by the conventional sense. I mean, depending on your view of pacifism. But I don't believe in initiating violence, at least, and I do believe in self-defense, and I believe that that can extend to those around us. But we shouldn't just go in at some kind of crazy level. I don't think that's helpful, and I think, like you say, that there are types of activism that do end up having negative consequences for a variety of reasons.
And in a way, they're almost, they do relate, but they're almost distinct questions. One is, what's ethically justifiable, and the other one is, given the broader things we're trying to achieve, what's effective. And obviously they link, right? Because ultimately, ethically, what we're trying to achieve is important too. So the effectiveness link, but sometimes they can blur too much, I find.
Yeah, I've always had this kind of stance that I would never publicly criticize someone else's activism unless they cause harm to an innocent person. And I've kind of stuck with that, and it's kind of seen me in fairly good stead. I've run campaigns that were completely lawful and completely above board and were based around garnering public sympathy. And other people have done actions really in support of those campaigns, but that didn't follow that kind of tenet. And, potentially, that could throw you into a kind of, how do I deal with it? Someone's damaged someone's car. Like, how do I kind of frame this in terms of this kind of very public facing boycott? And again, I just stuck with this stance that I'm not going to criticize it. I'm happy to tell the media I understand why it happened. It wasn't us. It's not something we want to do. It's not part of our campaign, but we do understand why it happened. We understand why the public are upset by this, because it's horrifying what some of these things that happen, or most of these things that happen. And yeah, it stood me in good stead to not criticize others. So I don't want to really get into what's a bad thing, but more kind of philosophically and broadly. I think it very much comes down to what you're hoping to achieve. And through the SHAC campaign, which is what my book's about, we were very confrontational. And I think we had an attitude that any publicity is good publicity. And really, the police and the pharmaceutical industry built this climate of fear around us that they then kind of projected onto us, and was part of the reason we were sent to prison, because we had created a climate of fear. But there was police units being paid by companies to go and present to them, like, the arson attacks and bombings that might happen to them. They were like, often a work of fiction or related to completely different movements, but they were making money from doing this and selling this idea, and actually, it benefited our campaign. Like, companies were scared to deal with this laboratory because what the police were telling them might happen, and in some cases did happen. So that campaign was, it had that thing, and so therefore, while I think public support of animal research plummeted during our campaign, because we made it part of the zeitgeist, we made it part of the kind of talking point, and shifted the Overton window on it, but it probably wasn't helpful in a lot of ways. And certainly when we were rounded up and sent to prison, we had been isolated very deliberately. We had been isolated from the rest of the progressive left. And that wasn't our choice or our decision, but it was something that the police had certainly been very meticulous about achieving. And it didn't help us. And there were actions that happened on the way that certainly didn't help us with public support. And maybe if we'd had more of that kind of public support and that kind of popular support, then maybe what happened to us wouldn't have happened to us, and we could have kept going, and maybe we could have won. But equally, maybe the campaign would have been less successful than it was. So
it's difficult, isn't it?
It's a hard balance. And I think for me, like, my preferred form of activism really is pressure campaigning and direct action, because they're things that can be done by anyone. And I think a lot of activism, particularly in the current world, is based around system change and large scale individual change, which is vital. Like, all of it is necessary. And again, that's kind of where I stand, is that all activism is positive. Everyone should be doing something, and those things are vital. But for just someone who finds out about some atrocity to know how to convince the government to change laws or to take action, it is huge and often completely unrealistic. But everyone can go out and take direct action. Everyone can do a pressure campaign, and those pressure campaigns, if they're well thought out and they're kind of crafted and carried out in a strategic way, can have incredible effect. And the SHAC campaign, we were this fairly ragtag group of activists across, we ended up like international in every inhabited continent, but we were really this fairly disparate group of activists that just had this common aim of trying to close this laboratory. And we ended up in the position where billionaires were scared of us. And I think that kind of situation is incredibly empowering. It's incredibly radicalizing. And to kind of realize that potential and kind of feed off it and grow off it and inspire others through it. And we continue to inspire, Palestine Action are heavily influenced by the SHAC campaign, for example, and there's plenty of others.
Yeah, the ripples go out far and wide.
100%. And it's why they took us out, because they weren't just scared that we are going to close this one laboratory. They were scared that we were a threat to modern capitalism. And so that power being wielded by me, just like some kid from a little town in the New Forest, and my friends, it's certainly eye-opening to see that that's what you can do. So for me, that's kind of my preferred form of activism. I think without every branch of this being attacked, we won't win anything. So I'd never say this is how to be an activist and this is what you should be doing, because everyone has a different background. We all have different skill sets. We have different social sets. There's a variety of different things that might influence where we head and just what we think will work better. People might see what I do and think it's just not helpful in it and it doesn't work, and they want to do something else. And honestly, like, I'm absolutely happy with that. I think the important thing is that everyone does something, because I think words like kind and good, they're not, to me, they're not adjectives. I think they're verbs. I don't think you have good people. I think you have people that do good things. And the same with kindness. I don't think you have kind people. I think you have people that do kind things. And so without people actively being good and actively being kind, it's nothingness, isn't it? It doesn't, nothing changes, and nothing, the world kind of maintains it, all the worst bits, because people who do bad things will continue to do bad things as long as there's like ways to profit from it, whether that's through money or whatever else. People will continue to do horrible things. So it's up to us to do really good things. And I don't think any one person can say they have all the answers on what that is, but it's vital to do something. And so that's why I always advocate for people who don't know what to do is really pressure campaigning, or if not that, then some level of direct action, and whether that's putting up stickers or chalking or up to the other end of things. We often get told one person can't change the world, but it's just so overtly not true. Like, hey, yeah, we can change it.
And even small impacts still matter, right? So if our decision criteria about whether to do something or not is based off whether I, as an individual amongst 8 billion humans, can solve the whole problem, no one ever does anything. And we know who likes it when no one does anything, right? If you blame everything on an anonymous system such that there's no point us individually doing anything, then we know where that leads, right? So
exactly. And I think the reason I was drawn into the animal liberation movement, because obviously I'm impacted by all the terrible things that humans do, and I think if I were to get involved now, I'd probably be more drawn to the environmental movement because it feels like it's winning. And when I got involved, the animal liberation movement felt like it was winning. So that was a big motivator for me. But also at the time, a lot of the concepts around environmentalism felt very, not quite theoretical, but certainly intangible. So in the early days of campaigning for climate change and stuff, and we certainly did that through advocating for veganism and stuff, we were very clear that this will benefit the climate as well. But those early days of the road protests and then the kind of climate change stuff, it's very hard to see that you're winning. It's very hard to see tangible progress. Whereas the animal liberation movement, I can just walk into a farm, pick up a chicken and walk out, and I literally have changed the world. Maybe not for everyone, but for that chicken, I've just changed the world. And that's a very tangible thing. And that's a very real victory and incredibly empowering that in just that one action, just one person has quite literally changed the world for someone else.
Yeah. And that individual matters. I mean, there may be hundreds of billions of others, but that individual still matters.
100%. And we all do. I mean, that's a weird thing with animal liberation in terms of physically liberating animals from places is the scale of these farms, particularly, and most abused animals are probably farmed in one way or another. When you go in, like, I was once involved in action where we rescued over 1,000 chickens from a farm, and of it, in a way, that should be this like amazing feeling. Like, we've just liberated thousands, we just changed the world for 1,000 hens. But the fact that then you have to leave behind 100,000 is a really horribly bittersweet feeling. And it's something that's often kind of hard to explain to people. I think the movie Okja kind of summed it up quite, I think they kind of managed to portray that quite nicely. But it was always a very odd feeling leaving a place like that and having to leave so many behind, and kind of having to have that on your conscience, even though it's not your fault, and you've done so much good. To know that you have to leave them behind it's a hard thing to settle, and it's not something I've ever really found a way of being at peace with. But then again, like, yeah, that's rescuing 1,000 more hens than most other people do. So yeah, it's a weird balance.
Exactly. And the only other thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the effectiveness of activism, and you've obviously played quite a strong role in using the media to share messages as well through the work with SHAC and others too, to sort of amplify that and to get the influence out there. One of the frustrating things about that effectiveness story is that, particularly in the animals, the non-human animal space, the public at large are desperate to find an excuse not to identify with the victims and with the harms being done. And it's so easy to distract the attention towards the activists themselves. So, I'm not going to go vegan because vegans are annoying, or, I'm not going to think about the beagles in the lab because look at what those awful activists did, right? So there's a distraction back to the messenger that people are desperate to, people want to do that because it helps them avert their gaze from the horror at the core.
Yeah, without doubt. And it's something that has, I think, Thatcher really initiated with the miners' strikes, but from then on, and certainly through Tony Blair and clearly the current government, they've managed to do this very clever thing that is to turn the public against protests. And they've turned working class people against unions, and it's remarkable that they've managed to do it. And it is this kind of slow dripping of media. And it doesn't help that our media is owned by a handful of very right-wing families. And I think, in terms of like looking at how do we get a better world, I think reclaiming the media is unfortunately a big part of that. And I'm not at this point sure how that's done without an ethical billionaire. And I don't know how many of those there are. But to kind of counter that, it is huge. And it's hard. It's not just the animal liberation movement. You see it with Extinction Rebellion. Like, literally, these people, and Just Stop Oil, but these people are fighting for our future. Like, they're literally like the air we breathe, and people will criticize them. It boggles my mind. And like I say, you see working class people moaning about strikes, and it's like, how do you not see that that's not the problem? But they've done it very effectively. And I think something that we have as a movement, the animal liberation movement, that is probably unique is I think we're probably the only social justice movement in history that is entirely comprised of allies. So, when bombs are being dropped on Gaza, the people of Gaza can share their stories, and they can fight back as much as they're able, and they can reach out to others to help them. In the suffrage movement was predominantly women, so the people taking the boldest actions, and the same in the civil rights movement as people of color, like fighting for their own rights, and obviously with allies. But predominantly the core of these movements is the people most affected. Whereas the animal liberation movement, as humans, we've removed the voice of the victims entirely. We've entirely oppressed them to the point that they can't fight back, and apart from maybe some orcas around the Mediterranean are having a go at it. But generally, we have removed their ability to fight back, and we refuse to acknowledge the fact they might be pleading for that liberation. And so the fact, to me, like, I've always found it like actually quite inspiring, the fact that we have historically and even now had such a strong animal liberation movement. And the UK was always kind of the heartland of it, really, or the birthplace of it, through the RSPCA and the early animal protection laws. And we birthed the Animal Liberation Front and Band of Mercy, and we had the big pressure campaigns like SHAC. So that's one thing, actually, as a British person, one of the few things that I'm actually proud of is our history of protest, and specifically our history of animal liberation activism. And the fact that, we have in the past, we've got like over 25,000 people out marching against animal testing. And, we don't see those numbers now, but it shows that we could, again, if we're able to project our message properly. So I do have hope that movement still exists within people. We do still view ourselves as a nation of animal lovers, as paradoxically as we project that. And yeah, so the hope is there, I think, for
Yeah,
me.
there's a latent human ethic we can tap into, isn't there?
I think so, and I do have hope that we can kind of return to those kind of numbers. But just the fact, during the SHAC campaign, the SHAC ran for 14 years, and in that period, there was 2 week period where there was no one in prison for activism against hunting and life sciences. Just 2 weeks out of 14 years, there was no one in prison for the campaign or the satellite campaign. So to me, like, and when I got involved, people like Barry Horn and Keith Mann, we had these political prisoners, and I think that was a big part of me getting involved, was that having prisoners for this movement, ironically, perhaps didn't put me off. It actually attracted me to it because there's people willing to genuinely fight for this, like actually put themselves and their freedom on the line for this, and because they felt we were going to win, and that kind of idea of inevitability of success is very appealing to me, and I believe we still have that. I don't think it's the same as it was, and I would like to see kind of more happening. And I certainly feel it's something we can build on, and then we'll build on in the years to come. But I think the fact that so many people are willing to risk so much as allies is incredibly reassuring, really. And however low our numbers get, the fact there's anyone willing to stand up and fight for this, I think is something we should all be very proud of.
Yeah, let's hope for humanity. Yeah, so
a little flicker.
When you think about intrahuman ethics, obviously there are many people around the world who are quite comfortable with the sort of exclusionary type of ethic that excludes certain outgroups from their own moral consideration. So for those types of people who are already quite comfortable drawing lines within humanity, it's pretty obvious why they might then draw some quite sharp lines around certain parts of non-human animals as well, right? That's somewhat obvious. But for humans who recognize some sort of universal imperative around human compassion or human rights, people who invest significantly in social justice causes, they might be on not necessarily on the economic or political left, but on the left in terms of a cultural and social justice cause left. I have a specific type of frustration for when those people struggle to engage with the non-human animal topic. And again, we could spend an hour on that, but I don't know if you've got a sense for why people who are richly invested in human social justice issues still struggle to engage seriously when the victims aren't humans.
I think that that idea of the Abrahamic idea that the animals exist for human benefit and no other reason, and we are intrinsically different, is so ingrained into our culture, like so deeply entrenched in our culture, that even people that have managed to kind of break free of a lot of the constraints of social reasoning are still bound by it. And it's something I like to point out to people, that those kind of people, the people who are progressive, otherwise progressive, is, can you explain to me in a way that isn't based on this religious concept that animals are just different for us, that therefore we can do what we want? Can you explain why it's okay to do what you're doing, and how this oppression is justified? And there is no way of justifying it without resorting, well, they're animals. There's no other way. Like, they're less than.
And the only other ways of doing it also inconveniently exclude human infants and various other groups of humans as well. Right? You can't cleave those lines cleanly based on any logic.
Exactly, and to follow the science is a fairly grim phrase these days, but following the science of biological science, evolutionary science, there is no reason whatsoever. There's absolutely no scientific reason to believe that non-human animals, any species of non-human animals, experiences the world in a vastly different way to us. There will be differences, but in a vastly different way to us. And anyone that's lived with another animal, whether a dog or a cat or horse or whatever, you will see the emotions in them. If I take my dog for an extra good walk, she will dream that night. And I can tell her what we're doing tomorrow, and she will wake up excited to do the things we're going to do. I can tell her what order we're going to do them in, and she'll be excited once the boring one's done because the fun one's coming. They can clearly think ahead. They have the capacity to remember. They have the capacity to be excited. They also have capacity to feel love and affection and fear and pain and all these very basic human emotions. And So if it's true that other animals have a very similar life experience to us or world experience to us, just for a moment, putting ourselves in the position of being a pig entering an abattoir or a mouse in a laboratory or a fox on a fur farm and what they endure. And a pig going to an abattoir, like that's, maybe the worst bit, but it's not the beginning of it. Do you know what I mean? They've had this whole life in this tiny area, and the domestic animals won't have a way of communicating with each other because we've taken them from their parents and their family groups and these kind of natural situations in which they might learn some form of communication. They don't have that. They're just kind of thrown in with these other non-communicative animals who they just have to kind of endure and find a way of living with in a very confined space, and then they're shipped out, and then they can smell and they can hear, like, one by one, these people that they were forced to live with being violently murdered, and they will know they're next. And to put ourselves in that, I don't think we really can. And I think a lot of what we do, like when we think of like the worst horror films that humans make, and they're all based on these things that we've just normalized doing to other animals. They're all about hunting for sport. They're all about experimenting, about imprisoning, about murdering for food. This is what our worst nightmares of what could happen to us. And we amplify it on this kind of biblical scale to all other species. And so, yeah, so when I talk to people about veganism and why I'm vegan, I kind of, in a more succinct way, say that, there is reason to believe scientifically that animals experience, or other animals experience the world vastly differently to us. And put yourself in that position. How would that feel? And how are you?
And surely that basic attempt to identify with the perspective of the other, it has to be central to any sort of morality. I mean, it seems that fundamental. And so many of the terms that are used in thinking about intrahuman ethics just apply across the boundary quite naturally. People will push back, but these things are oppression, and they are victims, and we can stand in solidarity. And so you can these same terms, why should they not apply? And it's a special sort of dissonance, right? There are some people you'll engage with who say, I just don't care because I'm very comfortable with exclusionary ethics, and they're just in an out group. But for people who purport to care about oppression and solidarity and have compassion and kindness, it's a very difficult sort of dissonance. And it's also interesting, and this is stretching things a bit further, but when you look at the relationships between certain forms of intrahuman ethics like colonialism, imperialism, and fascist modes of operating, for example, and draw parallels between how humans treat non-human animals, that's something we need to do very carefully and sensitively, because these are distinct situations and distinct groups. But again, the parallels seem, powerful and compelling, but something that many people engaged in the human social justice world don't really want to recognize or acknowledge. It's like like you say, a different world, and maybe it is because of that sort of biblical thing that's still sitting in the back of their mind. Yeah, thank you.
And a lot of it is not coincidentally similar. Like, intensive farming didn't exist before the Second World War. Like, a lot of these similarities between the way we treat other animals and the way we treat other humans are very clearly intermeshed. Like, there's a huge intersection across it. But I think there's two different types.
And what was the main thing that drove the land hunger that motivated a lot of colonialism? Well, you need space to ranch and grow feed crops, right? I mean, these things, they tie together in quite direct causal ways. So.
Yeah, but I think there's two types of people, isn't there? There's very instinctive people and people that at least like to think of themselves as being intellectual, people who like to think about things. And instinctive people will either say, I like meat, I'm going to eat meat, that's it, I'm done. Or they will say, oh my God, that's awful, I want to be part of this, I need to know more. And within kind of progressive activism, I feel like you're less likely to get those people that are just like, oh, I'm not going to be. You're more likely to get the instinctive people who are like, yes, I support you. Or you'll get the deep thinker type people, and that's why like I would lead with this basic science. Like, basic biology shows us other animals are the same as us. We are animals. There's no reason. Show me anything that suggests that other animals experience the world differently to us.
It brings us back to the epistemology, right? The basic facts of the matter. Yeah,
right. And then project yourself into that and tell me why you're not vegan.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's partly why I bang on about epistemology and ethics, because I don't think either is sufficient in itself. And when you look at the animal space, I would argue that a lot of the thinking that people do, or the lack of thinking people do, that justifies the harm we do to non-human animals is as much driven by epistemological failings as it is ethical. There are some people who say, I just don't care about animals. They're not, they don't count as valid moral patients. But most people use factual errors or ignorance or avoidance. They'll, farming is humane, or animals aren't sentient, or, whatever it is, right? It's actually the incorrect epistemology, I think, is more damaging than an explicit harmful ethic that just says, no, you're out. I can do what I like to you. So the final question, you've talked about capitalism a few times. And sentientism, again, is irritatingly broad because it doesn't really prescribe a sort of a particular approach to economic or political organization. So I've had fascinating conversations with people who agree with sentientism in terms of like, yes, use evidence and reason. Yes, all sentient beings matter. But they seem to span quite a broad range of different views about how you should organize society politically and economically. So some will be quite positive about the idea that we could have a more compassionate form of capitalism, where if the consumers and the regulators and the workers and the people who run the companies and the shareholders all had a more sentientist ethics, then you'd keep the freedom of capitalism, but you'd lose the exploitation and the harm and the concentration of power and some of the other dangerous things around it. So some people are, think there's a path forward for a compassionate capitalism. I suspect you'll be skeptical of that. There are others who see capitalism as intrinsically and unavoidably exploitative. So, we need some other system. There are people who think we need a more socialist or even communist approach where there are state mechanisms that embed a sentientist ethic and then operate in a certain way. Others who are very concerned that unavoidably leads to problems of authoritarianism or centralized control that can, crush the rights and values of various individuals. And then there are anarchist sentientists as well of different varieties. So anyway, I'll stop talking. I sense that you're probably quite skeptical about whether there are valid capitalist ways forward. So do you have a sense of what would be your sort of idealized utopian future state economically and politically?
Yeah, the idea of freedom and capitalism, I'm trying to mesh that in my brain. But
I guess that's what someone spinning a positive view of capitalism would tell you, would say, look, yeah, maybe so, right? Free to produce what we want, free to buy what we want, without.
I think, and I feel like it would be hard to argue this point against it, but humans are grossly overpopulated. There's way too many of us, and obviously that has issues in terms of the environment and our treatment of animals. But more kind of simplistically, I think there's too many of us for any political system to actually work.
Oh, interesting.
And so therefore, anything that we come up with, in my opinion, in the state we currently exist in, is kind of doomed to fail. And so with that in mind, I'm really kind of minded to think what's the nicest system we could have. And the nicest system we could have is anarchism, where everyone cooperatively works together, but also has the freedom to kind of do the things that they're compelled to do. And were that done nicely and we had nice people, then I earlier said there's no such thing as a nice person, but if everyone is acting nicely in that situation, then it would be a utopia, wouldn't it? But I'm at very least a theoretical anarchist. When we talk about capitalism, I feel a lot of people mistakenly think capitalism is any system with money, and it's not. It's the system of capitalism, particularly the one we currently live under, is this kind of weird late stage capitalism where we can see everything collapsing and we're not doing anything about it. It's a very new system, and to my mind, it's a failed experiment because we've only had this kind of capitalism for. I don't know, I'm not an economist. I don't know how we've lived on this, but it's not that long in modern history. We've lived with capitalism as the dominating system in Western culture, and in that short time, we've destroyed the seas, we've destroyed the environment, and we're literally making our planet unlivable. We have more, or at least the scale of war is in a scale that has never been comprehended in human history, and it's kind of hard to see what the benefits are, except for to like a handful of billionaires who have more money than they could feasibly spend in a lifetime. And so even for them, it's kind of hard to see really what the benefit of this kind of exponential accumulation of wealth is. So
Quite a few of them don't seem very happy either. So I'm
No, no, no. I'm
not.
sure, I'm sure oh, I like to think they're not, especially when SHAC turns up. But that experiment, yeah, like I say, it's a failed experiment, and we can go back. We had a system with money without capitalism not that long ago, and I'm not going to say everything was great. I'm sure, I guess the Industrial Revolution really ushered it in this brave new world, but things weren't great back then for a lot of people, but there's certainly things we can take from it, and it certainly shows that we can have a system that is based around. We really can take our current system and remove the capitalism from it, and there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of great things that a lot of the innovation and things that are done now. There are a lot of great things, or at least potentially great things happening, that you can just kind of remove the exponential lust for growth from it. And that's the problem, and that's what capitalism is prioritizing capital over people, over anything, and that's why you get longer in prison for protesting than you do for a lot of violent offenses, because what matters more is capital. And
So you're not, and this is the thing, you're not suggesting we go back and live in caves and revert to a barter economy and live like our Paleolithic ancestors and die in our 30s and have massive. That's not the alternative, right? It's just
it's not to me. I think
no,
it's an alternative, but I think there's a lot of nice things that I like having a nice heated house, and there's no reason I couldn't have that without capitalism. The problem is this exponential growth that it underpins it, that everything has to be more and more and more, and it's not healthy for anyone, really. Like you say, even a lot of super wealthy people aren't that happy because it's never enough. There always has to be more, and it's just this competition and this growth. And we live on a finite planet. There isn't room for infinite growth, and that's ultimately why capitalism can't succeed, because like everything can't grow forever. At some point, it has to stop, and capitalism doesn't allow those kind of fire breaks on it. If we were to keep the nicer parts of our society and move them out. Like you say, I'm a tattoo artist, and I recently closed my studio because it wasn't like a big capitalist enterprise, but I was taking money from artists to rent beds in my studio, and even just that just didn't sit right with me. They were paying me for a service because I was providing them a space and I was providing them with certain equipment and everything else, but ultimately they were the ones coming in every day and creating this art and creating it, and really they should be in charge of the capital, and at the very least we should be like a cooperative. And so I closed it, and I've opened a private studio with my friend where we split everything 50-50. So we actually now have this, I suppose, like a fairly anarchic kind of setup where we still use money, people still pay us for our service, but everything is split fairly, and we both like have roles in the studio, and we will both pick up each other's slack when we need to, but it works, and it works well. And we neither of us have an urge to open another studio and another one and another one. We're like, why? We have the space we need. We're creating, like artisanally, really, we're creating these tattoos that people want, and for a price that people feel is fair to pay, and it works. And I don't see why that can't be applied to every business. Like, we don't, like, every high street, like, how much more beautiful would it be to go onto like a high street and every shop is a local independent shop? And that is really taking us back to like a kind of like rose tinted glasses, nicer age, but it would be nicer. And I don't need to see a Pret a Manger and a Starbucks and a McDonald's on every high street. Like, I'd like to try someone else's food. I'd like to try someone else's like coffee, and to do that, it would be nice to have those things run locally. And I think as well, if I want a new table, I'd far rather it was made by someone down the road who like crafted tables out of oak and metal and whatever, than paying a Swedish company to exploit a Chinese worker to import a table to the UK that I still have to build myself. Like, it's such a bizarre system, and it's just kind of doomed to fail. It's very clearly, and we're in this kind of late stage where it's very overtly collapsing. And it's like, like the last days of Rome, we can see Rome burning, and yet we're just kind of like, nope, capitalism is the best economic way. And it just doesn't make sense. And there's so many things we could do just to kind of at least put a small C on the front of capitalism to kind of stop the growth.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's fascinating. Well, and I'm not expert enough to pronounce on this stuff, but what I do tell people is whatever your preferred economic or political mode of organizing, it will work better if everybody shifts towards sentientist values. So, like you say, anarchism will work better if everybody's
Vegan
nice enough.
capitalism is an interesting beast, and we live in a capitalist system. Unless we're going to overthrow capitalism, I'd rather live under vegan capitalism than non-vegan capitalism. And that's what we have. So, and I haven't, in my lifetime, I haven't seen any serious attempt to overthrow capitalism. There were some kind of fun periods in the early 2000s with the anti-globalization movement, but
and there's some interesting communes and collectives that spring up here and there around the world.
Yeah, but no real attempt to overthrow the system we have. And I think unless we're going to do that, then for the animals that are dying by the billions, I think we owe it to them to at least in the short term switch to vegan capitalism.
Yeah.
At least.
Yeah. Comes back to your earlier point, pull all the levers.
Yeah.
All types of activism are good, pretty much.
Exactly.
Well, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for spending so much time with me. Is there anything else you wanted to add? But also, how can people buy your Neighbour Kills Puppies and pre-order and follow you otherwise?
There we go. Oh, look, I have an advanced copy of my book. It is available from Pluto Press. It's on pre-order, so it's being published on the 20th of March. It's available for pre-order from Pluto Press, and I'm definitely not going to mention Amazon, but from all other good book
good and bad bookshops.
It's available for pre-order at the moment. It will be sent out on the 20th. I'm also having the book launch is going to be at Camp Beagle outside the UK's largest puppy farm who breed dogs for animal testing in Cambridgeshire. That is on the 24th of March. So yes, everyone is welcome to that. And yeah, available from Pluto Press. Your Neighbour Kills Puppies. I'll waft it up again.
Yeah, thank you. And do you do much social media? How can people follow you personally or?
So follow me personally. My Instagram is tattoo_Tom. That's probably the easiest way. I don't tend to accept people on Facebook unless they send me a message explaining who they are.
Yeah.
Instagram, you're very welcome. Everyone is welcome to follow me on Instagram. And if people have questions about me or activism or anything, the SHAC campaign or pressure campaigning, tattoo_Tom. You can also keep up with the SHACjustice.com, which is our campaign to try and secure appeals for our convictions for the SHAC campaign. So several of my friends and I, because I certainly wasn't the only person dragged from my bed and sent into prison for that campaign. So yeah, SHACjustice.com.
Thank you. I'll include the links in the show notes too. Well, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you. And hopefully I can count you as a celebrity sentientist too. But it's been such a pleasure having you on the Sentientism podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting. I hope it wasn't too much talk for you, Pat.
Not at all. Wonderful. Thank you. Say hi to Nikki for me too.
I will do.